Hello, everyone. So this, since I visited Sherman's grave, I made a couple shorts on that. I wanted to make a video about William Tecumseh Sherman. This is Warographics. So I'm going to do this video, and I haven't decided if I'm going to... If I do the whole video in one sitting, I'm not going to talk much. But if I start interrupting a lot to add things, then I might break it down into two videos. I'll probably break it down into two videos. So, let's just get going.
By Underlucky Stars. Commemorate a special time in your life or the life of a loved one with a personalised star map. More on them in a bit. It was one of the most notorious moments in an already notorious war. In November of 1864, Union General William T. Sherman struck out from the ashes of Atlanta with 62,000 men. His goal was to reach Savannah on the Atlantic coast and take the city from the Confederacy. But Savannah was only the final target. On his 285-mile march through the Georgian countryside, Sherman had an additional plan. One that would live on in infamy. One that could be summed up in a simple phrase. He would make Georgia howl. Over the course of 37 days, Sherman and his men unleashed a wave of destruction unlike anything the Confederacy had ever seen. Railroads were destroyed, farms looted, cotton burned, homes ransacked. While civilian deaths were rare, the population was left traumatized. Yet there was more to Sherman's march to the sea than sheer brutality. An early example of total war, Sherman's march was intended to crush Confederate morale. In doing so, the general hoped to bring the Civil War to an early end and thus save thousands of lives.
What he just said, I link, and I'm not saying it's right, but I link Sherman's march to the sea and the burning of the South to Truman dropping the bomb. Was it necessary? Who knows? Did it speed up the end of the war? Absolutely. Did it save lives long term? I believe so. Was it unnecessary? Depends on how you look at it. Was it brutal? Yes. Did it save lives? I think so. Am I repeating things? Yes, I am, because I can't say it's right or wrong. We're looking back through history to judge these things, and I equate Sherman's march to the sea with dropping the bomb. You know, that's two things to me where maybe it was extra, but it had to be. Maybe. That's just kind of where I stand on that.
Whether the cost was worth it is a question that remains controversial to this very day. On November 16, 1864, two Union columns marched out of fire-damaged Atlanta, 30 miles apart, and headed east. At their head was General William Tecumseh Sherman, fresh off his major victory in the Atlanta campaign. Before him lay the dusty trails and red clay hills of Georgia, with its forests and plantations, its colonial towns and small farms, its cotton fields and trees laden with hanging moss. But the beauty of the landscape was the last thing on Sherman's mind. He wasn't here to enjoy the mild climate, catch a Falcons game, or chow down on some pecan pie. No, the general was marching for one reason only: to make Georgia squeal, to rip up her railroads, devastate her farms, and leave the population so cowed they'd be unable to wage war. Yet, it'd be a mistake to think that the coming devastation was a spontaneous act, the actions of an impulsive, cold-eyed monster. The seeds for the dark harvest that George was about to reap had been planted months before. As 1864 dawned, the Civil War had been on the cusp of a new phase. The Chattanooga campaign the previous November had effectively seen the Confederates kicked out of Tennessee, leaving the soft underbelly of the Deep South completely exposed. At the same time, there was a huge shake-up underway within the Union's command structure. The whiskey-soaked military genius that was Ulysses S. Grant was in the process of being elevated to supreme command, and with him came a new strategy. The strategy of exhaustion. As Grant saw it, just letting the Union and Confederate armies slug it out had been costly in both men and time. Far better to attack not only the Confederate war machine, but the Confederacy's very ability to make war, to target its infrastructure, its factories, until its fighting potential had been completely exhausted. Yet while the germ of this idea came from Grant, it would be another highly decorated Union soldier who made it a reality: General Sherman. Born in Ohio in 1820, William T. Sherman was a West Point graduate who'd headed the military academy in Louisiana, only abandoning the South when war finally broke out. He was also perhaps Grant's closest friend, a stern-eyed tactician who'd stuck with the younger man through all his alcoholic days, a loyalty Grant had rewarded by helping reinstate Sherman after a mental breakdown. By 1864,
Sherman said, I stayed by Grant when he was drunk, and he stayed by me when I was crazy. Don't take what I just said 100% word for word, but that's pretty much the gist of what was said. So, Sherman had Grant's back because Grant had his back. And both of them together were flawed individuals, as everyone is flawed. But they were flawed, and they knew it. And they relied on one another. And I think that was not wanting. Sherman was Grant's right-hand man. Sherman didn't ever want to do anything to let Grant down. And Grant never wanted to put Sherman in a position where Sherman thought, the hell is Grant thinking? So they really looked out for one another, you know.
Pair were so tight that you could barely slip a sheet of paper between them. So, it should come as no surprise that the earliest incarnation of the strategy of exhaustion manifested under Sherman's watch. The Meridian Campaign is one of those campaigns that only Civil War nuts and people living in Mississippi have really heard of, which is crazy when you realize that it was basically a prelude to what we're discussing today. In February 1864, Sherman marched across the Magnolia State from Vicksburg to Meridian, allowing his men to raid farms while also destroying vital infrastructure. It was a devastating action, one that crippled swaths of central Mississippi. Importantly, though, the damage was mostly economic. Sherman may have had about as much sympathy for the Confederacy as most of us would feel watching Jeffrey Epstein get kicked in the balls, once declaring, "We cannot change the hearts and minds of those people of the South, but we can make war so terrible and make them so sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it." But he wasn't some deranged reincarnation of Genghis Khan slaughtering all in his path. Grant wanted to exhaust the South? Fine. Sherman would exhaust it, with extreme prejudice. But that wouldn't mean mass killings of civilians. Not long after Sherman's first destructive march, Grant finalized his grand strategy, a bold plan that envisioned hitting the Confederacy on 5 fronts. General Nathaniel Banks would attack the vital port of Mobile, Alabama, a plan later changed to an invasion of Texas. Meanwhile, the Army of the Potomac would engage General Robert E. Lee's army, while Benjamin Butler marched on Richmond and Franz Sigel disrupted Confederate communications. The last front would be Atlanta, a vital railroad hub for the South, the place from where food and weapons flooded out across the Confederacy. Taking it out would make the exhaustion strategy a reality. And Grant had just the general in mind to bring this grand city to its knees.
It was me. Shut up. No one cares. No one cares. Come on. Really? How long are we going to stick on one? A couple days? It's me!
Of course, the Atlanta campaign wouldn't be quite so simple as Grant yelling, "Yo, Shabs, get down to Georgia and kick a little Dixie butt for me. Between the Union and the city lay an 80,000-man Confederate army under the control of Joseph E. Johnston. While Sherman's combined force...
Side note, Grant, in his memoirs, considers Johnston one of the toughest Confederate generals because he was a guy who really thought about how to attack you, didn't attack you if he didn't have the numbers. Why risk it? Why put his men in jeopardy? He was Grant was very conscious of Johnston because he respected him so much as a leader and a strategist and stuff like that.
Forces of the Army of the Cumberlands, the Army of the Tennesseans, the Army of the Ohio exceeded Johnston's total, it wasn't by a huge margin. So as the Union force left Chattanooga in spring of 1864 and headed south, it wasn't at all clear that Atlanta would fall, that Sherman's men wouldn't fail in their mission. But the Yankees had a couple of advantages on their side. The first was that Sherman was simply in another league to Johnson. Although he was respected, Johnson wasn't a Stonewall Jackson, a miracle worker who could turn the tide of battle. Instead, Johnson was a guy who liked to play it safe, so safe that you'd have to wonder if he'd ever experienced any emotion other than wary caution. His whole shtick was...
Again, take what he's saying with a grain of salt, because Grant felt he was very good for what he did. Maybe he wasn't, like I said, he wasn't somebody who would attack if he didn't have the upper hand, because that was just a waste of men. He was really strategic on what he did. He's making him sound like he's worse off. Okay, well, you could say that because the Confederacy lost, so you can downgrade those people looking back. But that doesn't mean that they were actually on this level because they lost. Johnston was a better guy, according to Grant. And when it comes to Simon Whistler or Ulysses S. Grant, talking about a man in Grant's time, who are you going to listen to? I'm going to listen to Grant. But I'm not saying that he's wrong. I just think that it's easier to bash the losing side. Not trying to defend.
Retreat, dig into trenches, and let the enemy get cut down when they charged head-on. A potentially deadly strategy, but only if your opponent was dumb enough to go for the full frontal assault. And, as we'll soon see, Sherman was rarely that dumb. The other plus for the Union was that Sherman had the confidence of his superiors and was surrounded by competent commanders like George Thomas and James B. McPherson.
George Thomas, Grant thought extremely high of. And George Thomas was actually West Point roommates with Sherman. So those two, that's the better one. They were super tight. I don't know much about James McPherson. I know a little bit. But George Thomas was when Grant took over, he was a guy who kind of looked at Grant and thought, all right, Grant's in charge. Okay. He didn't think much of him. But he wasn't a guy who, because he didn't think of Grant as much or think as highly of Grant, he still respected the chain of command and did what he had to do. And I think after a while, those two got to learn more about each other, and a mutual respect was there. But I know Grant really thought highly of Thomas. I don't know if Thomas ended up feeling as much about Grant as reversed.
Johnson, by contrast, had a famously stormy relationship with Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who seems to have found his general only fractionally less irritating than hemorrhoids. He was also surrounded not by commanders who had his back, but by guys like John B. Hood, who openly wanted his job. So, as Sherman's army crossed into Georgia that May, they did so with a small but real edge over their opponents. And in the fight for Atlanta, that small edge would be all they needed. The moment the campaign kicked off, it set the pattern of combat for the summer, with Johnson trying to dig in while Sherman tried to flank him and force a retreat. And retreat the Confederates did. By May 25th, Johnson's men had pulled all the way back to New Hope Church, just 35 miles north of Atlanta. But even though Johnson managed to halt the Union advance both here and at Pickett's Mill in blistering actions that saw the Confederates make mincemeat of the Yankees, it was just a reprieve. By early June, Sherman had again flanked Johnson. Once again, the Southern forces left their trenches and drew backwards towards the city. Yet while Sherman's advance was inexorable, it also wasn't a cakewalk. Remember when we said Sherman was rarely dumb enough to try a frontal assault? Well, there's a difference between rarely and never. On June the 27th, Sherman nearly lost everything by pulling this exact maneuver at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, a bloodbath which saw 3 times as many northern casualties as southern ones. But this horrific misstep wouldn't prove fatal. Even as his men fell, Sherman once again managed to flank Johnson. Once again, the Confederates were forced to pull back. And so the slow grind toward Atlanta continued. July 1864 dawned on a city sweltering in the heat and suffocating under a blanket of fear. Prior to the Civil War, Atlanta had been home to some 20,000 people. Now a mere 4,000 remained, a mix of white women and children and enslaved black people. As Johnson dug his final trenches just beyond the city's limits, those left began to panic. Nor were they the only ones. As evacuation orders were issued, panic was also starting to grip Confederate high command. On July the 18th, Jefferson Davis finally removed the annoying hemorrhoid that was Johnson, replacing him with Johnson's old frenemy, John Hood. A guy who'd already sacrificed one leg and one arm for the Confederate cause, Hood's gamble was that he'd come out swinging, take the Yankees by surprise, and hit them so hard they'd be knocked clear back across the Mason-Dixon line. While the first 2 parts of this plan would succeed, the crucial third part would be where it failed. After a summer of fighting, the Confederates were simply too weak to rout the Yankees. Like it or not, William Sherman was coming for Atlanta. By the time he was done, there'd be very little left. Alright, we'll get back to today's video in just a second, but first, quick word from a brand new sponsor, Under Lucky Stars. Under Lucky Stars make these. Look at this. There's my big light, but this is a personalized... Can you guys hear me okay? Let's get that mic over there. This, showing you exactly what the stars look like. It's on thick, museum-quality matte art paper, and there are 15 designs and border styles to choose. And now back to today's video. In the end, Hood's glorious...
I hate how the ads pop up and then all of a sudden it's kind of like, oh, the ad can't play. It could pop up, couldn't it?
Hood's glorious strike back amounted to a mere 3 serious battles. 3 battles, none of which went the way that he wanted them to. There was the Battle of Peachtree Creek against George Thomas's forces, which ended in a draw, but didn't solve the problem of the massive goddamn Union army that was approaching Atlanta. There was the Battle of Atlanta itself, which saw Union General James B. McPherson killed, but only at the cost of thousands of Confederate soldiers. Not that Hood felt like celebrating anyway. He and McPherson had been classmates in
Sorry, it started getting a little glitchy.
Classmates in their West Point days, and the general's death hurt Hood almost as much as it hurt Sherman. Finally, there was the staggeringly one-sided Battle of Ezra Church. On July the 28th, McPherson's replacement, Oliver O. Howard, led his army to try and cut off one of Atlanta's main railroads. Hood threw everything in a suicidal attack to try and stop them. And suicidal is absolutely the right word. Against 642 casualties on the Union side, Hood lost over 3,000 men. In the mere 20 days he'd been in charge, John Bell Hood had overseen a depletion of his ranks usually associated with an outbreak of smallpox. Wounded, broken, he switched tactics, turning instead to a defense of the city. But really, the campaign was over. All that was left to do was take bets on when Atlanta would fall. In the end, the siege lasted till September. In that time, Sherman set up artillery to pound the city. Starting on July the 20th, shells began falling onto the hot, dusty streets, piercing the humid air with a whizzing sound before crashing to earth. One estimate we saw claimed 30,000 shells hit Atlanta over the next month. On August the 9th alone, 7 people were killed, including 2 children and a freed black barber. Yet, despite the casualties, this wasn't some merciless revenge bombing, an attempt to level a symbol of Southern pride and all within her. Even as the shells fell, the Federals were trying to take out the railroad to cut all the supply lines. Finally, on August the 31st, they succeeded. That day, during the Battle of Jonesboro, the last of the 4 tracks linking Atlanta to the wider world was taken by Sherman. When he received word, Hood knew the game was up. On September the 1st, the remnants of the Confederate Army fled. Everything of military value not destroyed in the shelling was set on fire or blown up. As they retreated, looting swept the city, a last giddy convulsion in a place whose time had come. The next day, Mayor James Calhoun formally surrendered Atlanta. He did so, hoping the Union would protect people's property, but there was no such luck.
So, just so we're clear, the burning of Atlanta was done by John Bell Hood's men leaving, not wanting anything to fall into Union hands. Sherman gets blamed for this because when he showed up, it was burning. Not only was it burning, they left all the alcohol pretty much just out. It was fair game. And the soldiers back then, you couldn't really trust them. They just saw the alcohol and started getting drunk. And getting drunk stopped their pursuit of Hood. The fire, thinking that they might, they did, turn into firefighters to an extent, stopped their pursuit of Hood. I'll go for a few more seconds and then we'll finish off that section and then we will end the video and come back with part 2. Really? Yeah, keep doing that. I like that.
After 6 days of
There.
occupation, Sherman issued Order 67, forcing the 3,000 remaining civilians to evacuate. By September the 18th, Atlanta was devoid of people not connected to the Union Army. Back in the north, the fall of Atlanta was the news everyone had been waiting for. After a miserable summer in which most of Grant's 5 points of attack had been thwarted, the fight had seemed to be draining out of the Union, and with it, Abraham Lincoln's chances of re-election. Now with...
Just want to say, I'm going to stop it here. That was a picture of Lincoln pre-presidency. Any picture of Lincoln with a beard is after he was elected. So they should have used a picture when he had a beard. We're going to stop it here, and we will be back with part 2, and we will go ahead and finish it up. Card shuffle. So I'm not going to say much. There's a thanks button. You can donate to the channel, subscribe, thumbs up, and I'll see you back at part 2.